Hi everyone and welcome back. So this is the second lecture in our series about the Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. The first lecture covers the summary of the book and examines the structure and some of the main characters. So if you haven't seen that one, I recommend you go back and watch that first. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the historical background because while a lot of this book takes place in the Second Sino-Japanese War, which we'll talk about what happened there. A lot of the book takes place during that time, but the author doesn't include many historical details to kind of explain how this war came about and what happened after and things of that nature. In the third lecture, we're going to look at some of the themes in the novel. And then in the last lecture, I will be talking face to face with you about how this book fits in with some of the American literary movements and traditions that we've been discussing throughout the semester. So let's get started. That's a picture of Chinatown in San Francisco a few years back. The book was published in 1989. The mothers are the four women who formed this club that they called the Joy Luck Club, and their stories take place mostly in pre-World War II China, just before and during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945. Now, we do get some of the mother stories later. We see, as I mentioned previously, a lot of these stories are nested and embedded within each other. So they might have flashbacks. They might be talking about something that's happening in the 1980s, and they might have a flashback to this time period or to the 1960s when their daughters were younger. Sometimes the women involved, by the time the war comes, most of them are in their 20s. So some of their stories take place earlier. I mentioned that we get a glimpse of one of the women when she is 4 years old. Another is engaged or has an arranged marriage at the age of 2 and goes to live with the family of her betrothed husband when she's 12. So some of their stories take place a little bit before this, but this war is really the reason that they emigrated from China to the United States. And I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what happened and what they would have experienced. The daughter stories occur primarily in San Francisco from the 1960s through the 1980s. And then at the very end of the novel, June, who I mentioned has been called the primary narrator because she gets a little bit more to say than the other characters. June visits China in the final section of the novel, and that seems to take place around 1989 when the book was published. So the Second Sino-Japanese War is something that we don't really hear about that often. I think primarily because we're in the United States. When we talk about World War II, sometimes we get information about the Pacific Theater. That is the battles that we had with Japan after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But the majority of the time, in my experience, people are really, in our Western culture, really focused on Europe and Hitler, sometimes Mussolini you'll hear about, but not as much what happened over in Asia. At least that's sort of my impression of how World War II history is often talked about and discussed. If you watch the History Channel, you're going to see a lot of things about Hitler and maybe not so much about what happened in China and Japan. I want to say before I start this, I'm not a historian, but I do want to give you guys some background so that the novel makes a little bit more sense. That's sort of the purpose of this. If you're a historian and watching it and I get something wrong, you can email me and let me know. But the Second Sino-Japanese War was a military conflict waged between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan from July 1937 until September 1945. The war ignited from a conflict between Chinese and Japanese troops for control of the Chinese mainland. And it really was the largest Asian war in the 20th century. It got something cut off there. It contributed to more than 50% of the casualties in the Pacific during World War II. So this war merged into World War II in 1941, but really had been going on before that. In addition to that, the war played a large role in the ultimate communist defeat of nationalist troops later on. So we'll talk about kind of the fallout from this war and what happened. So Japan's strategy was to take roads and railroads and then cities in order to gain control. So the idea being that if they took the lines of transportation, they would be able to cut off supplies. Despite the fact that Japanese forces were controlling the eastern coastal region, guerrilla fighting continued in the conquered areas. The Chinese nationalist government had been forced to retreat to basically what was a transitory or a temporary capital at Chongqing. But the Japanese did not have the capability, really, or just based on numbers alone, to directly control all of China. What they did instead was they set up puppet governments that they felt would favor their interests. So this is kind of interesting that the intention wasn't fully to take the country over the way we might think, right? What they really wanted was different government involved. China, and we have some Chinese troops. China, their struggle here, they really were not ready for the war. They had an economy based on or at least largely based on agriculture, not as much mechanic strength. So they lacked significant military industrial strength, and they really didn't have as much armor support. So when the Japanese came in and took the roads and cut off supplies, they struggled to keep up with that. They depended on the League of Nations to come to their aid and offer countermeasures to Japan's assault. And then at the same time, one of the things that weakened China further is that the Chinese Nationalist Party was fighting internally against the Chinese Communist Party. So if you think about the American Civil War, it wasn't, other than this further complication, wasn't that much different. When the North and the South did battle, the South was largely based on cotton, on agriculture, and they didn't have the factory power that the North had to kind of keep up with the demands that a war entailed. And so, again, cutting off supplies and things like that were some of the things that helped the North to prevail. And basically the same thing is going on here. The added difficulty is that there's also infighting, so there's no strong structure of support either. The Chinese were forced to come up with a strategy which aimed at preserving their army strength. And in addition to that, occupied areas continued to exert pockets of resistance to disturb Japanese forces and make their control of China as difficult as possible. Now, as the Allies were fighting the Axis powers, and Japan was one of those Axis powers, China really is considered to be an ally against the Axis during that war. And there's a historical nonfiction book called Forgotten Ally, China's World War II. So if you want to hear more about this and find out more of the history of how this happened and the understanding of World War II and its aftermath, that's a great resource. In the meantime, we also have refugees. Now, this is really where the characters in the book, some of them are in this position of being refugees. So June's mother, I mentioned, gives up 2 of her children, her twin girls. And I think that to contemporary readers, you'd be like, how could she do such a thing? It's clear in the book why she does it. But the country by this point was really torn apart. So the women have come together and formed this club while all of these things are going on. And some of them are in this position of being refugees. During the war, there was a decision made to break some dams. It says a, but I believe it was more than one, in order to fight the Japanese. Thousands of Chinese villages were flooded and destroyed. Millions of villagers were forced to evacuate their homes, and over 400,000 people drowned. An additional 10 million became refugees. So you have all of basically China deciding, in order to fight the Japanese, we're going to have to make this decision. And this is never expressed in the novel that this is what happened, but this is what happened in the background. This is why these women are refugees, and sometimes their husbands and children as well. There are all these people who are displaced, and at that point, the Japanese invasion of Shanghai in 1937 led to more refugees. 30 million Chinese fled their homes in terror and live in a sea of bitterness as refugees. In total, throughout the war, the property loss suffered by the Chinese was about $338 billion. That would be our money today. And it created about 95 million refugees. So people who really had no place to go. Author R. Keith Scopa explains, quote, "They fled through unfamiliar terrain and coped with unimaginable physical and psychological difficulties. Within the context of Chinese culture, being forced to leave home was profoundly threatening to one's sense of identity." So we're going to talk later about identity and the immigration experience, but you have these women who are really undergoing extreme trauma, and how they deal with that trauma affects their children later on. And that's why this is so important to really understand for the story. After this point, we have the Chinese Civil War, which takes place from 1945 to 1949. And here is a picture of a person in the Chinese Communist Party trying to rally people together. So in 1945, the USSR, that point in time, declared war on Japan, armed the Chinese communists who were in conflict with the nationalists. So a little bit of Russian interference, supposedly to get the Japanese out of the country, but really, in addition, to help the Chinese communists who had been infighting and really starting this civil war. After World War II, the Sino-Japanese War ended. Now that there's no outside conflict, the internal conflicts really heat up. The communists fight the nationalists. By 1949, they have taken over. And by 1954, just a few years later, communism becomes the law in China. So there are some benefits to communist rule in China. Concubines are no longer allowed. Polygamy, the sale of children, the interference of remarriage with widows were all banned. So these are things that some of these women go through. They are promised in marriage at the age of 2. They are involved in a polygamous relationship. Their parents try to... The one woman who is a widow and remarries, her family tries to interfere and stop her from doing that. In addition, women were at least assured equal rights with respect to employment, property ownership, and divorce, but there's also a controlling of religion. Missionaries are expelled. There are many people who are oppressed in other ways. And really, these changes were achieved through terror. So between 1949 and 1952, over 2 million so-called counter-revolutionaries were executed. And we still see some of that iron fist of China today in what they're allowed to say, what they're allowed to read, whether or not they're allowed to practice religion, all of those things. They really, the freedom of speech that we have in the United States, it's quite a bit different over there, and that's sort of how this came about. So here is an excerpt from the Joy Luck Club. I didn't want to give you an excerpt that kind of gave away any of those beautiful details, but this is how their club was forming. People thought we were wrong to serve banquets every week while many people in the city were starving. Others thought we were possessed by demons to celebrate when even within our own families we have lost generations, had lost homes and fortunes. It's not that we had no heart or eyes for pain. We were all afraid. We all had our miseries. But to despair was to wish back for something already lost, or to prolong what was already unbearable. So I love this. Oh, I'm like getting chills. I love this excerpt, this quote, because it really shows that you have these four women who have tried to overcome so much. And, their so-called banquets, they describe what's actually involved. But the fact that they come together to form this club is really what helps them to overcome this tragedy and overcome this trauma. And it really, in that sense, is a beautiful story. I didn't talk about friendships, or I won't in the next presentation, but friendship is really another theme here that is strong and pervasive. There is a lot of trauma, a lot of displacement. Their villages have been flooded. Their loved ones have died. They are out on the road with nothing. And yet they're able to come together and to overcome all of those miseries that they've gone through. So I hope that this helped kind of fill in some of the gaps in the story and give you a more rich understanding of those parts of the novel. Next time we're going to talk about some of the themes, and I will see you there. Thanks.